The Escape from Ruthin Gaol. You probably think that being in jail is exciting. You'd be forgiven for imagining a life behind bars as glamorous, a dog-eat-dog world of criminals and vagabonds, in which only the toughest and canniest may survive. You dream of the stories you'd hear of armed robberies and vengeful murders, and the people from the very dregs of society. Men without morals, capable of the most heinous and bloody acts known to Christendom. As children, we're told tales of daring escapes, hiding from armed guards or snatching keys from sleeping jailers, of rooftop chases or hidden tunnels. But, to my regret, prison isn't like that. Prison is deathly tedious and mind-numbingly dull. I've been in this cell for more than 3 weeks. The novelty wore off after barely half an hour had passed. Far from the cunning criminal masterminds I had envisioned, the other inmates thus far have been nothing more than a succession of vagrants and tramps, old and wretched drunkards mainly, with little to no conversation. Queen Elisabeth doesn't like vagrants. She has them locked up, off the streets and out of the way. Those that travel from place to place looking for work, begging or stealing, it's always the poor that are punished for poverty. But I am not a vagrant. I travel with a purpose, to learn, to explore, and to perform. It is the great Welsh tradition of the bards which I follow. Every step I take, 1,000 great and noble poets have trod before me. I am the heir, the apprentice, and the historian, all in one. Everywhere I go, I inherit the sacred knowledge of our ancestors. Unfortunately, the eyes of the law do not look down favourably upon our culture, as those who cannot pay the price of living are belittled, extinguished, and forgotten. It was a bright summer's morning when I left Llandeisant, and it was almost dusk by the time I crossed the hazardous Menai Straits. I was travelling alone, further than I ever had before, to study with the old masters of Welsh music who live in the Vale of Clwyd, familiar names with imagined faces. The journey took me along the beautiful coast, through forests, over mountains, and across the open countryside. When I finally arrived at that ancient and rather forbidding farmstead in the village of Gwyddelwyn, I was exhausted from several days' travel, and found to my delight a warm welcome and hospitality I'd only known from my family and friends. I knew that I was at home with these strangers. After a blissful night's rest, I began my studies with my new tutor, Ieuan ab Ithel. Somewhat stern and very earnest, he was keen to ensure his extensive knowledge of music and poetry would not be lost on me, a mere upstart of 19. He needn't have been so concerned, for I share his reverence for our history and culture. I'd lived with it all my life, had it drummed into me from the day I learnt to walk. Each new generation brings hope and fresh issue to aging traditions. But to the older folks, they pose a tangible threat, that the things they hold dearest to their hearts will become corrupted and impure in the hands of youth. Those that are willing to teach the next crop of young men often do so with a certain strictness and solemnity. Nevertheless, this man's lessons were fascinating. I learnt new knowledge that seems to me now totally fundamental, which I had never known before. I saw old edicts from fresh perspectives. I felt my wits sharpening with every passing hour I spent in his company. And most importantly, I learnt for the first time how to write music down on paper. This was something truly enlightening, for it had never before crossed my mind that such a thing could be done. To preserve beautiful melodies like an insect in sap, so that years from now I may recall them as sharply as the day I heard them first. To recreate the sounds as perfectly as the scent of a flower may resurrect a long-faded memory. After a long day of learning, I'd eat a humble dinner with my hosts. Yeyan's wife, Rhiannon, was an excellent cook. She had a remarkable ability for putting her guests at ease. And all would engage in meaningful discussion over dinner, picking through complex topics with insight and perspicacity. My tutor was a man of strong opinions, but his wife and daughter would never shy away from arguing against him, or playing devil's advocate simply for the sport of it. Sometimes I could not tell one from the other. Fleur, their daughter, 2 years my junior, would relish an intellectual battle with her father, often mocking his pomposity in a manner most entertaining to me. Although discussions frequently became heated, there was always a glimmer in the eyes of all three, to whom intellect was simply an instrument upon which one plays. I recognized my own family in these people. I too would engage in such conversations at home, which could last for many hours after dinner, and even reappear over the following days, when new opinions had been formed. However, I chose to be more circumspective than I would have been with my parents, so as not to appear rude or foolish. For 2 days a week, Yeyan would go out into the fields to work, and I would be left to practice the harp by myself. It was on one such afternoon that Fleur came in to hear me play. She listened intently for some time, and when I stopped, she clapped politely and complimented me on my skill. After that, we sat together and talked for over an hour. She asked me about my upbringing, my home, my family, and in return told me about her family, her education, and funny stories about her father's exploits.
We talked about music, politics, and culture. We talked about milking cows and baking bread, and when her mother came in and asked her to help with the housework, I remembered what I was supposed to be doing. As I played on, fragments of our conversation echoed through my mind, and I found that I could not shake her from my head all evening.
When I came into the kitchen the next morning, Fleur was sat there eating an apple. She smiled at me, her eyes glowing. I smiled back as I uttered a greeting to her. My heart fluttered slightly in my chest, and I realized that this new infatuation must be hidden at all costs. My face stern, I buried my attention in study. However, as the weeks went on, our friendship deepened, and I tried as hard as I could to lie to myself, like an ailing man ignoring his symptoms.
On our Sunday morning walks to and from church, we'd chatter away together, far ahead of her parents, barely noticing as time dissolved around us.
I became increasingly distracted from the sermons, as I began to notice every fidgeting movement she made beside me on the pew, and longed only to touch her hand, or for her leg to brush against mine. One evening over dinner, we all shared a joke, and in our laughter, my eyes met hers. Only for an instant, but I knew then that her feelings for me were the same as mine for her. That night, as I was going off to bed, I heard her whisper my name from the semi-darkness of the kitchen. She was stood there, her head cocked to one side curiously, a sheepish smile across her mouth. "Good night, Robert," she whispered to me, her voice splitting like ice.
"Good night, Fleur," I managed. In the flickering candlelight, I saw her blush and look away. "I'm going to miss you when I go to Corwin," I braved. She looked at me for a moment, the beginnings of tears welling in her eyes. I paused, trying to think of something to say or do, when all of a sudden she took a step forward and kissed me very gently on the mouth. Her lips were dry and cracked from the oncoming winter, but soft, like feather pillows. The physical reality of the moment seemed to contradict the divine beauty of what I felt inside. My heart racing seemed to crack in two. My breath cut short, I was drowning without a care in the world. For a split second, I felt eternity in my very soul. A love so pure it could never be soiled by mere earthly woes. I fell asleep as if in a dream, and dreamt that night only of reality. For now, reality was better than any dream.
For the next few days, nothing happened. The lessons continued, the meals, the discussions. But I felt a distinct unease every time I thought of Fleur, and of the few remaining days I had left at Place Flavor. I knew something had to be done, else I'd regret it forevermore. Yet she seemed to be avoiding me, as I never found myself alone with her for more than a few minutes, and her mother or father were always nearby. When I tried to meet her gaze, she was always looking elsewhere, distracted, as if unaware of my presence. With only 2 days left, I became desperate. I waited for the right moment, then grabbed her arm. "Can we talk this evening?" I whispered. She looked at me, surprised, then nodded before freeing herself and returning to strangerhood. That evening, after her parents had gone to bed, we met once again in the silent candlelight. The embers of the fire faded like a sunset in the grate. She stared at me, her lip beginning to quiver. We hugged, as if for dear life. We broke apart and kissed again, stronger this time, as her tears tickled my cheeks. "I love you, Fleur," I said, having never meant anything more sincerely in all my life.
She sobbed her reply into my shoulder, as I cradled her without the first clue of what to say next. We sat there for what felt like an hour, and when I finally spoke, I'd made up my mind.
As we walked briskly together down the starlit road, I imagined what would happen when Yeyan and Rhiannon awoke in the morning, expecting an ordinary day ahead of them, only to find their daughter and their guest vanished together. I thought about the hastily scribbled note we'd left on the table, explaining as best we could. I wondered what they'd say when they read it. I hoped that what little we'd taken from the house would keep us safe and warm. My soon-to-be bride was so beautiful that night. She squeezed my hand, and I felt safe. I knew then that everything would go to plan, and that this escapade would prove an entertaining story for our children. How foolish I was. We were to visit the house of a family friend in nearby Pwllglas. There we would plight our troths before God with our friends as witnesses to the contract. Then we would return to Place Laylor a married couple, and later perform an official church service to legitimize our vows before the community and the law. However, when we arrived in Pwllglas, the family would not accept our love, and locked us in a room until the father returned with Yeyan in tow. This did not stop us from performing the ceremony ourselves, though, and whatever the bishop's court may say, Fleur is my wife, and I her husband, before the very highest authority. Naively, I had not expected such rage from my former tutor. Rhiannon, too, was furious. This pained me more, for she had hitherto been kind and sympathetic to me in all things. "How could you do this to us after everything?" These words still haunt my dreams to this day. So too does the look in the eyes of her father and the words with which he scolded me. But more than anything, the terrible, piteous cries of anguish from my wife. Her face contorted in such a way that made her hideous to look upon for the first time. And she was dragged away. I could only cry helplessly and vow to return for her when I could prove myself a valid match, with enough money to support us both.
And thus was I released from custody, and allowed to continue my tour. I travelled next to the house of Margaret Uwch David in Corwin, less than 5 miles from Fleur. As much as I was desperate to see her, I knew that I had to return to my music and prove myself to her father. I confess that the zeal with which I had approached my studies in Place Laylor had dissipated somewhat, and my new teacher was sour and somewhat suspicious of me, having heard of my so-called abduction. Nevertheless, I worked hard in Corwin over the winter, and by the beginning of April, I was almost ready to move on again. Margaret and I had not exactly become friends, as she had never forgiven me for abusing Yeyan and Rhiannon's hospitality. and she would not have taken me in at all were it not for the promises she had made to do so, and for the sake of passing on the knowledge she held so dear.
Her face was permanently fixed in the countenance of a toad chewing on a wasp, yet I was grateful to her, and tried to be the very paragon of politeness and civility as long as I was there. However, one afternoon she found a letter I had written to Fleur, and on the reverse her reply.
We'd been sending them back and forth for some time, once I had made a friend who was willing to be our secret messenger.
To read her words on the page was enthralling. To hear them read by her voice in my head, a great comfort. Once again, we expressed our undying love for one another and exchanged news, opinions, and stories, just as we had done months ago. Also included in her letters were manuscripts taken surreptitiously from her father's collection, some of my favourite melodies, which remind me so vividly of that happy time whenever I play them. Margaret was furious when she read our exchange. How tragic it is, I thought, that the love of a man and his wife could ever be considered scandalous. She told me to leave her house and never come back.
She swore that I would learn no more sacred knowledge, and that under her watch I would never graduate as Pencaird.
This struck a deep blow within me, for I had always taken my work seriously, and now I would never succeed. In that moment I made another rash decision. As I collected my things, I slipped a few brass cups into my bag, wrapped in a blanket for the sake of discretion. I thanked her for her generosity and left on horseback for Plasanion, some 8 miles north, in the village of Llanfairdyffryn Clwyd, the home of my recently made friend and benefactor. On my way, I visited my beloved Fleur. I couldn't help myself. I knew that her parents would be out tending the fields that day, so I crept in through the other side of the house and found her deep in study. "Fleur," I hissed. "Robert." We kissed again, with passion like never before. We held each other tightly as I wept tears of pure joy. She looked different somehow. Her hair was cut short, and there was an aching sorrow in her gaze. She wasn't broken, but dented, as we all are by the passage of bitter time.
I couldn't stay long, for I had risked so much already, but what little time I had with her was more precious than the previous 5 months had been with Margaret.
I explained about the letters, and that her parents would likely find out. I offered to take her away with me, back home to Anglesey, where no one would know that our love was forbidden. But to my dismay, she refused. I must make my money, and she would meanwhile convince her parents to let us be together. Every yard underneath me felt like torture as I rode north, merely a few miles, but my destination may as well have been the New World, for I believed truly that I would never see Fleur again. Why did I have to steal from Margaret? For now I faced the dilemma: flee immediately and forever, or stay and face the music with some hope of reconciliation. The latter was so unbearable a thought that I chose to remain and suffer the consequences, however severe. So thus was I arrested at Plasanion, barely an hour after I arrived. For the theft I was taken to Ruthin, and indicted at the Court of Quarter Sessions.
Iean ab Ithel accused me again, this time for the theft of his manuscripts.
So now I sit here in the Red Tower, waiting, my marriage and career ruined forever. Now there's only one thing left to do.
Robert, come on.
Escape.
Whatever happens, the bards must stick together. Bribing the jailer is hardly as exciting a story as one might hope for, but it did the job quite adequately. I've just enough time to write my final letter to Fleur before I return to Anglesey, for escaping lawful custody is an offence for which I may hang. I'll apologise to her for every mistake I've made, to her parents for abusing their kindness, and even to Margaret for stealing from her. Although we may never meet again, I know that in the eyes of the Lord our love is as pure and true as sunrise. For what loss is a lifetime of love, when eternity awaits us both in the great beyond?